Welcome to our live recording of our A Course in Miracles, Exploring A Course in Miracles podcast. I'm Emily Bennington with the Circle of Atonement, and I am here with Robert Perry, founder of the Circle, and it is, of course, the Christmas season. And so the topic for our discussion today is the Course's Christmas story. As we say here so often, the Course is good at taking concepts that we are very familiar with, even ones that we consider sacred, and infusing them with entirely new meaning. And Christmas is yet another example of this. The Course has its own teaching on the meaning of this season that is just stunningly beautiful and can transform how we view this time of year if we allow it. Before we get into the discussion, however, I do have one quick announcement to make, and it's that here at the Circle, we have just recently started a free program called Getting to Know A Course in Miracles. This is a 14-day guided journey where each morning after you sign up, you'll receive an email for 2 weeks that walks you through what you need to know as a student of the Course, how it came, what the Course teaches, what it doesn't teach, and how to go deeper as a student if you choose. We are really proud of this program. It has been months and months and months in the making, and you can register for it at circleofa.org/events. Again, there is no charge. It is completely free, and so we hope that you'll check it out. Once again, it's called Getting to Know A Course in Miracles. So, Robert Perry, are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay, so let's talk about Christmas. We all know that the traditional Christmas story centers around Jesus's birth in the world. But before we get into the Course's version of the Christmas story, why do you think that a new Christmas story is needed in the first place? What's wrong with the original, the story that we were all familiar with?
Well, I think it's worth acknowledging just what a powerful story on a cultural level, at the very least, the Christmas story is. I mean, how many stories are as well known? I'm not sure if any are as well known in our world, at least in the West. So it's a hugely potent story, both because it's so well known, but also because it's just a powerful story. But that being said, you know, the Course itself has a lot to say about Christmas. Mostly, some of it very directly, some of it in just subtle allusions and references. But it clearly wants a new story. And there are a couple of big reasons that I personally think we need a new story. One is that there aren't really good reasons for thinking that the Christmas story as we know it happened. I mean, yes, Jesus was born. He was an actual individual that lived 2,000 years ago, but does the story as we have it that recounts how he was born, does that reflect actual history? And the unanimous verdict, I'd say it's pretty close to unanimous verdict of contemporary New Testament scholars, is no. There's all kinds of reasons for saying that. But one of the main reasons is that the Christmas story is really two stories, one told by Matthew and one told by Luke. There isn't the Christmas story in the Gospel of Mark or the Gospel of John. And if you read them like side by side and compare them, you start to think they don't have a lot in common. They're so different. There are points that are incompatible. And what's happened is over time, we found a way to kind of mush them into one story, oftentimes by just taking elements that are different in the different accounts and adding them both into the story. Like Matthew has wise men, no shepherds. Luke has shepherds, no wise men visiting the baby Jesus. So we just throw them together.
Was he born in Nazareth or Bethlehem? We don't know.
Well, both stories say Bethlehem, but
really?
Yeah, but in one, they travel to Bethlehem because of this census. That did not happen. Okay, it didn't happen. In the other, they're really already living in Bethlehem, and baby Jesus is born at home. So one of the ways we mush the stories together is by combining elements. Another way is by we pick the most interesting element and forget the other element is there. Like we just all think, there's the census, blah, blah. What Christmas story is told with them already living in Bethlehem? Well, Matthew tells that story, but we never tell it that way. So we're so used to the story as this composite of really different Christmas stories in Matthew and then Luke. And I think it's almost shocking to see how different they are. Another reason for believing that the story as we have it is not historical is there are major elements in it that we're quite confident from a historical standpoint didn't happen, like the census. The census didn't happen. There was a census that was a much more sort of minor affair that took place about 10 years later. Luke mentions when Quirinius was governor, and he was governor a lot later. The slaughter of the innocents that Matthew tells, where Herod comes in and kills all the infant males, that's the kind of thing that you would expect to have recorded in history. Anyway, so we just have a lot of reason to think that the story in Matthew was largely made up by Matthew. The story in Luke was largely made up by Luke. And so personally, I like real history. I mean, the crucifixion really happened, but the Christmas story, I don't think so. So that's an issue, a big issue right there.
Well,
and then go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, please.
Well, I was just going to say, for the purposes of our topic for today, the main point of the traditional Christmas story is that it is a celebration of Jesus and Jesus's birth. And so it's the whole focal point is this one person. And so if the question was, what is the big problem with the traditional Christmas story? And really, from the course's standpoint, it's focused on this one guy versus all of us. And we're going to get into why that is.
Yeah. And I think even worse than that, it's not just focused on one person, but the stories were designed to exalt him and make the point that he's, in some fundamental sense, not one of us, right? He's literally born of a virgin. And so he's in some literal sense, not the son of Joseph, but the son of God. Right.
Did you have anything else that you wanted to say on this question?
Well, just that the point of the story is to exalt Jesus. And I think that there's something wrong with that. I think it's really easy to kind of kick back and just praise and celebrate an extraordinary individual. But does that change you? I don't think it does. I think it's a way to feel a sense of celebration without anything inside of you actually being challenged to change.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So as I was saying in the introduction, the course has its own take on the Christmas story, one that is quite different than what we're accustomed to. In the course, Christmas is not an event that happened out there to one celebrated individual long ago. It is an event that happens and is meant to happen within each of us right now. And so I know we're going to kind of break this down as we go through, but just to set the table here, can you give us the 30,000 foot overview of the course's Christmas teachings?
Yeah, interestingly, the course doesn't talk about the Christmas story as something that happened Jesus talks about his miracles, his teachings, his crucifixion, his resurrection. All of those things he treats as happenings within the history of the world. He doesn't talk that way about the Christmas story, interestingly. What he does instead is he takes this really potent story of something from above being born into this world with all of its violence and insanity and conflict and darkness. He takes that story and says, let's not see that, as you were just saying, let's not see that as being about something long ago in a distant land happening to a particular, very, very special individual. Let's take that potent story and apply it to ourselves, so that it's about a spiritual birth in us. It's about the birth of a Christ child. And we'll talk about who Christ is. But the birth of the Christ child in us, and that birth in us being a momentous event that angels come and witness, and that infant thus born within us is then nursed and protected by angels. We need to protect that infant. And if we do, it will then continue to grow. And at some point, it will be ready to leave the nest, so to speak, and go out and do in the world what it came to do. And that is to extend the holiness that it itself is, to have a ministry in the world that's designed to contribute to the salvation of the world. And so it's kind of the same story. I mean, Jesus did grow up he was born, he grew up within the environs of his home until such time as he was ready. And then he conducted his ministry and changed the world. And that whole pattern, the Course is applying to us.
And it's a beautiful, gorgeous, transformational pattern if we really, as I was saying before, let in what it is that the Course is trying to teach us and to show us. And I promised you that I wouldn't drive our beautiful Christmas message into the ditch of metaphysics, but it does feel like if we are talking about this very lofty idea of Christ being born through us, then it would help to know how the Course defines Christ. You know, what is that? There are lovely teachings on Christ in the workbook under the section, What is Christ? And in the clarification of terms, there's a section called Jesus dash Christ, although just to be clear, Christ in the Course is not the same as Jesus. But what I thought I would do is read the first few sentences from What is the Christ, that section in the workbook, because I think it's really helpful. It says, this is from the Course, Christ is God's Son as he created him. He is the self we share, capital S self. He is the self we share, uniting us with one another and with God as well. He is the thought which still abides within the mind that is his source. He has not left his holy home, nor lost the innocence in which he was created. He abides unchanged forever in the mind of God. Christ is the link that keeps you one with God. And so, Robert, can you just explain in your own language what that means? So how is the Course defining Christ? What does it mean for us? And how do we let in the beauty of this idea?
Yeah, well, in the Course, its story of what is truly real and its story of heaven, the main characters are God and Christ. And God obviously is the creator, and he, as the Course says over and over, he did not will to be alone. So he created an extension of himself at one with him, sharing his nature, sharing all of his attributes, that was his one Son, the Christ. And he also created within this one Son an infinite number of sons, all having the same nature, but being numerically distinct, you could say, from each other. And that's the sonship, that's all the sons of God. But the really tricky part is that each one of those sons has as its true self, capital S self, the exact same self, which is Christ. So within Christ, there's this multiplicity of sons, each one of us. And if you go into the very core of each of us to our self, that which we are, we have the same self, the self we share, as that passage you read said. So we all share Christ as our single self. And Christ never falls asleep, even though the individual sons do. He always remains awake. And he is talked about in the Course in interesting terms, both as a friend and a companion, as well as a guide like the Holy Spirit, as well as this self that always remains our true identity and always remains awake.
Yeah, I was saying to you earlier that it would be helpful to have a diagram around this idea. So if you're watching or listening, if you can just picture God being the encompassing everything, and then there's Christ, if there's concentric circles, God is everything, and then inside of God, there's Christ. And then the Course describes it as inside of Christ is the Holy Spirit. And what's interesting to me is that as Course students, we spend so much time talking about the Holy Spirit, and yet the Course describes the Holy Spirit being inside of Christ. And Christ is that link to God that we all share. And so from the Course's definition, it seems like Christ is more powerful than the Holy Spirit, even though the Holy Spirit gets all of our attention. And also, this is where we can kind of get into the ditch, but what's interesting as well is that the Course talks about Christ as being a he. You were just saying he. And so
right.
what that means is that Christ, even though it's the self we all share, which just seems like a concept, right? The Course gives it some identity and agency, that Christ has a will. And so it's just interesting to think that, you have God, and then you have Christ inside of God, and then you have the Holy Spirit inside of Christ, and they're distinct beings in their own way. The Course also refers to the Holy Spirit as he, and yet they're their own beings. They're within each other, right? So it's wild to think about, within each other and one with each other. Yes.
Yeah.
And so the whole of the sonship, as you're saying, there's some individuality to us in the sonship, but the whole of the sonship is Christ. And then within Christ is the Holy Spirit. It's just fascinating to think about. And maybe we will get that diagram one day.
Yeah, I've actually done a version of that diagram. I think I've got it in my book, my workbook. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, it's not very well done. But
I hope that we've been able to express not just the details of what this is, the mechanics of Christ, but to give anyone watching or listening some sense of the beauty of this idea. I think at the heart of Christ is, as I was just reading from the workbook, the self that we all share, our communication, our link to God, rather. And so what an idea that the Christ is our eternal connection to God. And that's beautiful.
Well, and really, I mean, from the Course's standpoint, we all suspect, either consciously or unconsciously, that if we were to get in touch with the core of our identity, we'd find something ugly and worthless and rather harmful and dangerous. And what the Course is saying is if you could get to that very core of your identity, you'd find something absolutely perfect and holy and eternal. And so the idea of Christ being born in us is the notion of a spiritual self, a spiritual identity that is perfect, that is radiant and celestial, actually being born in us and growing up to the point where one day we discover, oh my gosh, that's the real me. That's a beautiful idea.
It's a gorgeous idea. And I love that you brought that up, because we do tend to think that if we get down to the very base of who we are, it's going to be ugly and a monster. But as the Course is teaching, you get down to the base of who you are, and it's perfect and holy. And more than that, it's shared by everyone. So
Yeah.
it's not just that you're perfect underneath it all, it's that everyone is in that capital S self that we all share. What a beautiful idea.
What a
If you
beautiful,
can think,
go ahead.
I was just thinking, if you could think of like spokes on a wheel, we're all the individual spokes, but at the center of it all, it's not just that you're perfect, it's that we're all perfect because we're all the same.
We're
And
all the
and
same.
that's amazing. Yeah.
Yeah.
So did you have anything else that you wanted to say on this question before I go on?
No, we can go ahead.
Okay. So as you were saying, and I know I gave you a really tough job to do, which is to encapsulate the Course's teachings on Christmas and this idea in a couple minutes. But thank you for that overview. But if we break it down, there are a series of steps here. And so what we thought we would do now is walk through the 5 steps of having Christ born through us, the Course's Christmas teaching. And so we can start with the first one, which is to make a safe space within us for Christ to be reborn. So do you want to talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, the basic idea, which the Course alludes to and even talks about at some length in different places, is that Christ is so holy and so perfect and so of heaven that he is alien to this world. This world is full of violence and full of separation and unholiness, full of sin. And so how can Christ come to this world when he and the world are just so incompatible? And so what the Course says is we have to make a safe space in our mind, really, that resembles where he's from. And one of the best examples or the best kind of descriptions of this is in lesson 303 in the workbook, which is The Holy Christ is Born in Me Today. And I'll just go ahead and read the first paragraph of that. It says, "Watch with me, angels. Watch with me today. Let all God's holy thoughts surround me and be still with me while heaven's Son is born. Let earthly sounds be quiet and the sights to which I'm accustomed disappear. Let Christ be welcomed where he is at home, and let him hear the sounds he understands and see but sights which show his Father's love. Let him no longer be a stranger here, for he is born again in me today." So what you see in that lovely paragraph is the idea that he has to, and it's not stated really openly, but it's kind of implied throughout the paragraph, he has to come to an earthly place that reminds him, well, that is a place where he feels at home. It reminds him of heaven, which is his home. And so the earthly sounds need to be quiet. The normal sights need to disappear. We need to make a place within us that is like a holy place.
Yeah, and this isn't an altogether unfamiliar idea. I remember when I was pregnant with my first child, you as a mom, you nest, right? You prepare the nursery, you prepare for the birth of your child. It's the nursery itself is practically holy ground. For your first child, it does tend to be a little different for your second child.
Right.
And so on. But we know what this is to create a sacred space. And so I love this idea that what we're doing within ourselves is creating that sacred space for the birth of holiness in this world. And so if someone is listening and they're thinking, okay, well, how do I do that? What is the process? How do we create this sacred space within ourselves?
Well, the Course talks about this in many ways. It talks about accepting a holy instant, where you leave your normal mindset behind, you leave all your thinking rooted in the past behind, and you kind of make a space for another state to enter your mind. It also talks about having moments of meditation where the Christ child in you is able to kind of feel more at home again. There's a great poem, actually, one of Helen's poems, I think it's called The Gift of Christmas or something like that. But in this poem, you go before the Christ child, and your gifts are all the things you need to let go of. So he says, or Helen's poem says, your gifts are but your open hands made clean of grasping. Nothing else you lay before the newly born except your doubts and fears, your pale illusions, and your sickly pride, your hidden venom, and your little love, your meager treasures, and unfaithfulness to all the gifts that God has given you.
Mm.
So those are the gifts you lay before the manger. It's all this kind of this poison, he even says venom, within you. And by laying those aside, you make a space for the Christ child to be born in you.
Yeah, and again, going back to that pregnancy example where we're creating that space for the birth of our physical child, we want to rid that space of all of the bad juju, right? Like we want to get rid of the negativity in that space. We want to create the calm environment for the baby.
And clean.
Calm and clean and beautiful and nurtured, all of those things. And so what it feels to me like he's asking for us here is to do that within our own mind. And so in order for the Christ to be born through us, it needs that same kind of preparation from us. He needs us to create an environment where he can grow. And just as a physical baby doesn't grow in an environment that's toxic, he can't grow in a mind that's toxic. And so our job is to give over our grievances, to give over our hate, to give over our attacks, so that we can feel his presence within us.
Yeah. Well, we were talking about this earlier, and I was bringing up these sci-fi examples where aliens come to Earth and they need a special atmosphere. And you said, well, what about when you're having a child and you make the room? And that's actually a great example, which had never occurred to me.
Yeah. Well, you haven't been a pregnant woman. And so...
Well, I have prepared a lot of spaces for children.
You built a lot of cribs. Anyway, we're going to run out of time if we don't move on.
Okay.
The second point on the journey is so after we prepare the space, a holy infant will abide in us. And so can you say more about that idea?
Yeah, well, I think it's implicit in what we said that when we make that space open, the Christ child is born in us, and obviously once born abides there. And I think in our experience, what this feels like is there's a new presence inside of us. And maybe it doesn't feel entirely like it's us. Maybe it feels like a somewhat foreign presence, and perhaps we have new impulses. Perhaps we have new guidance inside of us, and new feelings and new perceptions. And it feels like a light has turned on inside of us. And the idea is that light is this Christ child. And there's a beautiful place in the Obstacles to Peace section where it says, what has been given you, even in its infancy, is in full communication with God and you. In its tiny hands it holds, in perfect safety, every miracle you will perform, held out to you. Behold this infant to whom you gave a resting place by your forgiveness of each other, and see in it the will of God. Here is the babe of Bethlehem, reborn, and everyone who gives him shelter will follow him, not to the cross, but to the resurrection and the life. So once that birth happens inside of you, even if you perhaps lose awareness a bit of that birth and life seems to return to normal somewhat, there is this tiny infant that has a need for protection and yet has this power and holds in its hands all that it will do through you someday, even if it's not ready yet for that to happen.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting juxtaposition, because you've got this kind of infant that is alien to this world, that is unfamiliar with the violence that's here, doesn't know about all the toxicity that we have in these bodies and exterior to us. And so it needs our protection in order to grow, yet at the same time, it carries with it all the power of God. And so it's just interesting that it's both all powerful and fragile at the same time.
Yeah, right. And you can kind of imagine there are a lot of things in this world that grow up to be really powerful, like an elephant.
Like Jesus.
Or like Jesus, but start out seemingly very small and weak and vulnerable. I mean, think about a seedling that's going to grow up into a giant redwood, right? There are a lot of things that contain within themselves a future adult state that's very powerful and yet start out small and fragile.
Okay, so we've got the first phase, the first step is that we need to make a safe space within us for Christ to be born. Once we do this, the Holy Infant will abide in us. And then the third step along the way is the angels will come and protect and nurse this child. And also interesting, when the Course says the angels will come, it's not speaking in metaphor. It's talking about literal angels. So would you want to say more about that?
Yeah, and we've done a podcast on angels. I love that topic. It's very clear that the Course is giving angels the same status as the Holy Spirit and Christ and God and ourselves. They are real beings. And that was clear before the original dictation of the Course came out, where there's some very explicit references in chapter 1 to both angels and fallen angels. So I feel like this point, to get into the angel point, we should say that before they protect and nurse the child, they also come to attend the birth. And there, the Course is drawing upon the Christmas imagery, where angels are such a part of the Christmas story. They are there because this birth is so momentous, has such significance, because heaven in some sense has come to earth. So of course they would come and attend and watch and take part and help out.
Yeah. No nativity is complete without an angel.
Got to have the angels there.
And donkey, but
and they're singing,
angels
and they got trumpets, and
for sure. Yeah.
Way more important than the donkey. So
I'm sorry, I interrupted you. What were you saying?
Well, I just think that we should apply that to what the Course is saying about us here, that when we allow that spiritual birth to happen in us, that Christ child to be born within us, it's so momentous that angels really do come to attend that birth, to sort of be midwives for it. And according to that lesson 303 that I read a few minutes ago, they come just to watch. It's so important. So that being said, they not only attend the birth, but they stay to protect and nurse the child. And there are some beautiful passages about that. I don't think I'll read them just for time's sake. But again and again, when the Course talks about angels, it will often have subtle Christmas imagery associated with them. And even when it doesn't, it will portray them as like guarding some spiritual birth that has happened, so that the light that was born in us doesn't go out. So they spread their wings over us to protect us, not from things of the world, but from our own worldly thoughts.
Yeah, that's again another gorgeous idea. And if anyone is interested in learning more about what the Course has to say on angels, we did a whole separate podcast exclusively on that topic. So if you go to circleofa.org/podcast and do a search for angels, you will find it. But one thing, I know you're saying you're not going to read your passage in the interest of time, but I can't resist reading this part of a poem from Helen. Helen's poems are rife with angels. They just appear all throughout.
There's more angels in her poems than there are in the Course, I think.
Yeah, I think we talked about that in the podcast. Yeah. So it's just really fascinating. But one of the things that she says in a poem called "They Wait," I think is really relevant to the Christmas season, because the way that it goes, it says, "I did not know your voice, and what I heard I did not understand." I'm kind of skipping around passages here. "Yet all I found in its immensity was but the sound of meaningless contention." And that feels to me like what the Christmas season has become. It's just this
the sound
busyness.
Of contention.
Yes, this busyness, this focus on shopping. You got to get all the things done. It's become stressful. And then the poem goes on to say, "I passed by 1,000 waiting angels. And as I rushed along vain detours, I did not see the hosts of holiness surrounding me. Yet I will certainly return," et cetera, et cetera. And so I love that idea, because it really does feel like it encapsulates what's going on here. You know, we're rushing around with all of our attack thoughts and judgments and whatnot. And there are these angels who are just waiting for us to claim the holiness that's within us. "I passed by 1,000 waiting angels." I think he's serious about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
that they
is.
really are there. And they want to help. They're waiting to help, and we're too busy in our busyness to stop and be with the sacred that's within and around us.
I think we want to make them metaphor because it doesn't seem non-dual enough to talk about actual angels. It sounds like old-time religion. But when you think of angels at the presence or at the birth of Jesus, the message is clear. This has such significance that heaven has come to earth, that messengers of heaven are there too. Well, what a beautiful thought that happens when we have a spiritual birth take place within us. And then they stay to, as he says, nurse that birth and protect it.
Yeah, and nursing is such like an intimate concept. I mean, the Course is very specific in its use of language. It's very intentional in its use of language. And so this idea of nursing, it's like that's how close they are, right? Like that's how much they want to be part of this growth in us. Okay, we're running out of time. So we should move on to the fourth stage, which is we need to protect this child.
Right. And this is really important because once the birth happens in us, I think we know that we are a danger to it. You know, how many times do you know of someone or hear of someone who has long-standing unhealthy patterns and they have this great breakthrough and you think, wow, it's so wonderful. What's your next thought? Are they going to stay true to it as time goes forward? Or will they trample it? Will they discard it? Will they, unravel that great moment of forward movement? That's kind of what we do. And so that's why the angels are there, to make sure that birth stays protected so that it can keep growing within us rather than being snuffed out. But we have to cooperate in that. And this is said openly in Lesson 182, "I will be still a moment and go home." It says, "This child needs your protection. He is far from home. He is so little that he seemed so easily shut out. His tiny voice so readily obscured. His calls for help almost unheard amidst the grating sounds and harsh and rasping noises of the world. Yet does he know that in you still abides his sure protection. So just like this is true of everything born into this world, right? It needs parents and it needs support so that it can, rather than, be damaged and snuffed out, it can be safe and grow. And the angels play that role. I'm sure the Holy Spirit does as well, but we have to play that role. We have to be a good spiritual parent of that birth within us, because we all know that the human tendency is to have that moment, that great breakthrough, and then what happens?
Well, yeah, we know that concept too, right? Like, so the preparation of the nursery for the sacred preparation for the birth of your first child, and then the child comes, and there's many moments of just like unconditional love, and then the child becomes a toddler and you're like, oh my God, how am I going to deal with this? And so it just feels like the beautiful idea of Christ being born through us, which is really, I mean, the values of Christ being born through us, the forgiveness, the holiness, etc.,
But the
attributes
presence
of God.
The presence, the Course acts like this is an actual presence, an alive presence within us.
Yeah.
Even if we're most of the time not that aware of it, it's still there.
But that, right. So just to be clear, it does speak of Christ as I was saying before, he with his own agency, etc. But the values that he carries with him are the attributes of God. That's the thing that we're meant to come. They're meant to come through us and into the world. Yeah. And that's going to get tricky, right? So it's just like toddlers are tricky. Forgiving unconditionally is tricky. And so it's up to us. The angels can't override our will, right? And so it's up to us to continue to keep our minds clear of judgment. It's up to us to continue to nurture that sacred space within our mind so that he can grow stronger within us. And so the protection comes in large part, well, it comes from us. And so we have to focus on it versus focusing on all the other busyness that we tend to focus on instead.
Right. And I mean, it comes from us, but as they say, it takes a village, and the rest of that village, in large part is on the invisible side, like the angels. But what you brought up from my standpoint, when you say that, well, it becomes a toddler, and then is that, babies disrupt your life. They bring something new into your life that, I often have said about my first child, his birth was like a bomb went off in my life, and the pieces never really got back together because, suddenly your life becomes so much about tending to that disruptive little presence. And I think it has to be the same here because, it's not like the Christ child is constantly crying and wailing and getting into cupboards and eating soap and all that. But it is a disruptive presence because once that birth happens in us and starts to grow in us, it starts taking us places that we wouldn't go on our own. Mm-hmm. It starts to, reshape our life, dismantle our old life, build a new one. And that can be extremely disruptive, at least from our standpoint.
And that's a really good segue into our fifth and final point, which is the Christ child grows up within us and conducts his ministry through us. So there is something that he wants to do through us in the world. Right. And he needs the safety of being able to grow strong within us to do it. And so right. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, well, that does connect with what I was just saying, because the idea, just like, a baby bird has that nest and grows up in the relative safety of the nest, and at some point is able to leave the nest. I mean, all living things do that, right? they grow up, hopefully in safety, they get strong, then they go out into the world to be themselves and to do what they're here to do. And so that Christ child in us that starts out as an infant wants to become a kind of adult and then move through us to conduct the holy ministry for which it came, just like Jesus conducted his ministry. And so it's here not just for us, not just to give us have a light be present within our minds. It's here to contribute to the salvation of the world. And I think that is a wonderful idea.
Yeah, I don't like using this language, but it feels like the best form of possession, right? Like Christ is born in us, grows strong in the environment that we make for him by getting rid of our grievances and our judgments and forgiving. And then he has something that he wants to do through us. And then our life takes on that whole new journey. And as you were saying before, you're right. It is very analogous to having children, because once that child is born, you can't go back. Your life is never the same.
Yeah.
And so that you mentioned Jesus, and it just reminded me that this feels like the real significance of Jesus in this story. So it's not just that the Son of God, the one Son of God, was born and we're all celebrating that. It's that Christ is born within us, and that's what we're celebrating. And where Jesus fits in is that he was the one who did this first, right? Like he was the one who accepted Christ first and went out and did his own ministry. And so what we're being asked to do is to make the same choice that he made and allow Christ to work through us in the world so that we can be miracle workers, right? So we can be those who express love in the way that he did. We don't all have his healing ability, but we can certainly accept our ministry and go out and do it as we're being asked to do.
Right. I mean, one of the things he says is that we were created, he and us were created as equals. The only thing that's different about him is he made a different decision. And decision is something, we all have that faculty. We can make the same decision he made, and we can then allow Christ to be born in us in this world just as he did.
Right. So if we're going to celebrate Jesus this time of year, then let's celebrate his decision to say yes to having Christ be born in him and perform a ministry through him. And that's not something so different. In fact, it's not at all different than what we're being asked to do. And that's the real Christmas story, isn't it?
Well, yeah. And what if for the last 20 centuries, we had seen that story as a potent symbol of what was meant to happen in us, that we were meant to allow Christ to be born in us and to grow up within us and to then go out and conduct his ministry in the world through us. That gives the story such a different meaning. It's one that challenges us to accept change inside of us and to go places we normally wouldn't go. If we had had 20 centuries of millions and even billions of people seeing the story through that lens, we could be in a very different world.
It would be a completely different world. Marianne Buchowski, one of our teachers here at the Circle, she did an Advent series last year, and I was listening to part of it in preparation for our discussion today. And one of the things that she said, and I know we've said this before, but she said, just think of if Christ was your last name, because it is in the course, right? So if you were Robert Christ or Emily Christ, instead of just Jesus Christ, where he's the exalted one, and if we brought Christ into our picture of ourselves, and if we had been doing that for the last 2,000 years, what a different world we would have. It wouldn't be so much about his story. It would be Christmas is all of our stories, and what are we doing in the world to express the love of God? And so,
Yeah. It's
yeah,
so safe to praise a baby. It's just so safe, right? It
yeah.
doesn't ask any change of you whatsoever. Anyway, what
Yeah.
were you going to say?
Okay. So what I was going to say is that we are running out of time as usual. And was there anything else that you wanted to say on this idea before we?
No, let's go ahead and go on to the next point.
Okay. So just to kind of recap where we have been, the journey of the course's Christmas story is that number one, we need to make a safe space within us for Christ to be reborn. Two, once we do this, the Holy Infant will abide in us. Three, the angels will come to protect and nurse this child. Four, we need to protect this child. And five, the Christ child grows up and conducts his ministry through us. And again, just a beautiful idea, gorgeous reframe of the Christmas story. But as we were preparing for this today, you had an insight that the course's Christmas story is very similar to the course's origin story. So do you want to share that with us?
Well, yeah, I mean, it seems like it's such a wonderful idea to take all that significance that we have put in the Christmas story and transfer it to being about a spiritual birth in us. And then I thought, making it contemporary like that is not unrealistic because that's what happened with the story of the course. Helen and Bill, they had all of, they were dealing with all of the conflict in their own relationship and conflict all around them in their professional lives and even personal lives. And then something happens. They had their moment of joining, they had their holy instant. And that, you could say, was like the conception. And then Helen begins to have these visions and dreams and psychic experiences, and she begins to hear a voice in little snippets. And then finally, about 4 months after they had that holy instant, which I'm calling the conception, there's the birth. And Jesus is, in some sense, born. He is speaking to Helen, and suddenly his words are on paper, and there is a birth that has happened. And that birth is followed by, a number of years in which they are allowing that birth to continue, but it's in the nest, right? They would go into Bill's office and they close the door and nobody knew, or hardly anybody knew. And a certain magic moment is reached, and Ken Wapnick comes and Judy Scutch comes, and she becomes this catalyst, and now, bam, it goes out into the world and to do its ministry. And so this exact thing of making this safe space for a holy presence, in this case, the very presence of Jesus, to come in, to be born, to grow up in the safety of the nest, and then once it has sufficiently grown, to go out and conduct its ministry in the world. That's the story we just told.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
And we were just saying, we can make that our story, not a story from 2,000 years ago and thousands of miles away. We can make that our story right now. And the course is a perfect example of that. That is also the course's story.
Yeah, when you were talking about that, I was thinking, gosh, that's so true. What a neat connection. And then I started to think, well, gosh, that connection is so present throughout the course. In Course Companions, we just had a class on the beautiful section for They Have Come, where it talks about when you let God and Christ in, then the ground on which you stand becomes holy ground. And that's the same kind of idea that's going on in the origin story of the course. And it's the same idea that is going on here in the course's Christmas story. So this is just an idea that Jesus continues to return to and really wants us to get.
Right. There is this whole pattern found in many different forms throughout the course, whereby essentially we repeat the Christmas story.
Yeah.
And all of that meaning from way out there becomes personal in our own lives.
And there's one point of clarification where when we were talking about this, I was saying, gosh, we're just always pregnant with Christ and we can't quite get him to be born, right? And you were like, no, that's not it. The pregnancy is a journey. And you likened that to after Helen and Bill had their moment of conception, the Better Way moment. Helen had those 4 months where she was kind of incubating,
right.
if you will, this thing that was going to be born, which is the course. And so the pregnancy itself, like, we're not always pregnant. This is a very specific moment. It's a very holy, sacred moment, and we should treat it as such.
Yeah, we're always potentially pregnant with this spiritual presence.
Yeah.
But something happens when we actually let it in.
Yeah. So we are 2 minutes till the top of the hour. So is there anything else that you wanted to say on this idea before we close?
Well, nothing that we haven't said. I think I'll just reiterate, maybe because I feel I haven't really said it all that well, but just reiterate this idea, like, we can take all of that meaning, all that glow that there is around the Christmas story, all that sense of just being drenched with divine significance, and apply that, to our own spiritual journey, where we are attempting to have the Christmas story be repeated in us in a very real sense, where there's a real birth within us. There are real angels. There is a real process that culminates in a real ministry.
Yeah, I know. Incredible, isn't it? It's just like knee-bucklingly beautiful. And again, in preparation for our discussion today, you and I kind of went over a summary of all the Christmas teachings in the course, and it's a summary of your writings over the past 30 plus years. And there's one paragraph in one of your summaries that I just found to be so beautiful. So if you're thinking now that you're not explaining it all that well, even though I disagree, I want to read this paragraph because I think it's really truly among the most beautiful things you've written. So this is from Robert's summary of Christmas teachings, and I'll just read a paragraph of it. So rather than seeing the Christ child as a unique divine infant outside of us, we should see him as being born inside of us, born in us to awaken us to our own divinity. Rather than seeing his birth as something that happened long ago, we need to realize that the birth of Christ is now, without a past or future. Rather than seeing the Christmas star shining in the skies of ancient Palestine, announcing the birth of Jesus, we should see it shining in the heaven within, a sign of the impending birth of the Christ within us. Rather than welcome him into the lowly manger of long ago, we should welcome him into his true home, the temple of holiness deep within our minds. Rather than playing modern-day wise men and offering the Christ child lavish gifts of love and praise, we should give him our ego's poison, our illusions, our resentments, our pettiness, so that our minds are clear of impediments to his birth in us. Rather than demanding that our brothers give us generous gifts in order to prove their love, we should release them from all demands and offer them the freedom of true love. What a great way to summarize this the concept that we've been talking about today. So I love this idea. I love that as course students, we can make Christmas our own. The same is true for Easter, by the way. The course has given its own reframe on the meaning, the real, true meaning of the holidays, and allows us to take part in them as course students, but in our own way. And that's just a beautiful thing, that Christmas isn't just Jesus's story, it's all of our story. We can be newly born ourselves, and as such, we can also be saviors of the world. So Robert, thank you for once again for all of the work that you've done to pull all of this together for us. And if anyone would like to attend the live broadcasts of our podcast recordings, we do these every other Monday at 11 a.m. Eastern. You are welcome to register at circleofa.org/events, where you will find a link to sign up. And we will see you all next time. Bye for now.